It's 2026. It seems nothing works, voters are ignored, and the country's going broke. Do you ever stop to ask yourself, where did it all start to go wrong? Let me take you back 25 years. I was younger, less grey, a newsman. One morning as the news came through on the wires, as we called them, the newsroom scenes filled with horror. Everything seemed to change in that moment. So do you remember where you were when 2 passenger jets, repurposed as guided missiles, flew into the Twin Towers in New York? Later this year, even the mainstream media, ordinarily less than enthusiastic about examining the threat posed by radical Islamism, will be forced to peel back their eyelids and stare hard at what happened a quarter of a century ago. Perhaps you weren't even born then, or maybe you were metaphorically born yesterday, convinced that 9/11 was the work of dark, probably Jewish, forces. Time was when only lunatics on the Arab street believed that guff. I've met them in Islamabad in 2001 when the rubble at Ground Zero was still smoking. I interviewed a former boss of Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI. He told me Mossad was behind 9/11. He almost certainly didn't believe that, but he knew that ordinary Pakistanis would. Even then, weeks after the attack, it was already a popular conspiracy theory in parts of the Muslim world. In the years since, that virus honestly has spread. A fifth of Americans, for instance, according to a YouGov poll 2021, now believe that their own government was somehow involved in orchestrating the bloody events of 2001 in New York and Washington. It is, as we used to say in Britain, doolally. I know that conspiracy theories, by their very nature, are almost impossible to successfully debunk, but indulge me, let me try. After 9/11, I became a war correspondent. I was with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan when they were routed by the Taliban, and in 2003, I was embedded with the US 3rd Infantry Division, George W. Bush declaring war on Saddam Hussein. I was attached to the first ground forces that went into Iraq and the first to reach Baghdad. We were, as the saying went, the tip of the spear. The whole basis for that war, you'll remember it, the sustaining casus belli, was the discovery and removal of weapons of mass destruction. And we found them. Or at least for a few hours, we thought we had, there in the desert. I was working for Sky News, also embedded teams from CBS, AP, as well as a reporter from the New York Times. The soldiers we were travelling with, they found a huge cache of explosives and material. It was all being sent off for analysis. They weren't sure, but it looked like this was it. We'd got the WMD. It would have been the simplest conspiracy imaginable to bring to fruition. So easy to pull the wool over the media's eyes in the middle of nowhere, as we were. All the army had to do to say, it checks out, it's anthrax, ricin, nuclear, whatever. And we would have beamed the message back home, nowhere to check, fog of war, job done, mission accomplished. And that's not what happened. It didn't happen that way. After a few hours, our military media handler came to tell us the stuff we'd found. It wasn't WMD, it was just bog-standard explosives, still very good at killing people, just without the macabre glamour of WMD. After 9/11, conspiracy theories, thanks to the internet, went mainstream. But 25 years on, so much else has changed. Would we, the British, now, for example, send our infantrymen, sailors and pilots to fight alongside our American cousins, as we dutifully did in Iraq and Afghanistan? For one thing, we could not. Our armed forces are a spectral shadow of what they were. For another thing, we would not. Not under Starmer. He's in hock to his own backbenchers, who in turn are spooked by the surging support enjoyed by the Greens and their Islamist fellow travellers. You might say that if Britain hadn't got involved in Iraq, that would have been no bad thing. I disagree. Iraq may have been the wrong target. Frankly, Iran made more sense. But I believed then, and I still do, that answering America's call to arms was the right thing to do morally and politically. The Blair premiership, it may have been a long-term catastrophe for Britain, his legacy truly toxic. Immigration to the Equality Act, from devolution to the disastrous growth in university enrolment. But he was right to commit our troops to Afghanistan and then Iraq. It's noteworthy that those nations now willing to run up their colours next to the Stars and Stripes are often those former communist countries caught behind the Iron Curtain. It's fashionable to argue that places like Poland are, as my old Sky News colleague Tim Marshall might say, prisoners of geography. That they are more likely to boost defence spending because Vladimir Putin is breathing heavily just over the border. But that ignores something deeper. Those Eastern European countries, they're not just prisoners of geography, they're prisoners of history. I remember sitting in a car in Hungary in 2015. We were following the massive columns of migrants who were heading for Germany. Angela Merkel had invited them in. The mainstream media insisted, by the way, they were all Syrian refugees. They absolutely were not. As we drove along, our local Hungarian producer switched on the midday news. All we could hear on the radio was the tolling of the Angelus bell. What was all that about? I wanted to know. Well, the answer came back. The bells commemorate a famous victory over Ottoman forces centuries before. I realised in that moment that for many Eastern Europeans, they remember what it was like to have laboured and toiled and perished under the Soviet or Muslim yoke, to have lived under the threat of a shadow in the East, as Tolkien might have put it. They have not lost what the philosopher Roger Scruton called the tragic sense of life. We, on the other hand, most assuredly have. We are now governed by metaphorical pygmies, politicians with barely any hinterland beyond the Students' Union. Did you know, for instance, that more than 70 of this Parliament's intake of Labour MPs had worked in the charity sector, not running businesses, not working as engineers, working for charities, learning how to spend other people's money, more than 70 of them. This kind of grotesque overrepresentation, it's bound, it has to skew a government's priorities, the way they think, the way they act. Nothing could encapsulate just how frivolous our political class has become than the sight last month of Labour, Lib Dem and Tory MPs dancing at Portcullis House, the overflow offices of the Palace of Westminster. They were there, they said, to raise awareness about obesity, more accurately, themselves. The point is that while they were indulging in a puerile display of peacocking, the Middle East was on fire, British citizens were being targeted in the Gulf, and the Royal Navy nowhere to be seen. If ever an image could have been conceived to symbolise our moral decay, parliamentary decadence, and institutional narcissism, then this was it. There are honourable exceptions. You maybe have people you can call to mind yourself. Here's my take. We still have some MPs who understand that Britain's future hangs by a gossamer thread, who comprehend that unless the country changes course on immigration or welfare and defence, then frankly the game really is up. Take the Tory MP, Nick Timothy. When he was standing for the constituency that he won against the odds in 2024, Nick asked me to put my name as a former GB News presenter to a letter to some of his more right-leaning voters. I was happy to do so, even happier now, frankly, when I see what kind of MP Nick has become: brave, principled, tenacious. He's a reminder that backbenchers can still make the weather politically from the backbenches. He pretty much single-handedly, for instance, forced the government to face up to what was happening in Birmingham when Islamists and the police combined to stop Israeli football fans from coming to the UK. And he's not afraid to paint a target on his own back. How many MPs would have been willing, as he was, to denounce end of Ramadan prayers in Trafalgar Square and point out that such a scene amounted to a display of domination, a tactic, he said, straight from the Islamist playbook? Well, Keir Starmer called for Nick Timothy to be sacked for saying any of this. But honestly, I think Nick was onto something. Around the country, expressions of Islamist territoriality are, in my opinion, being normalised. What am I talking about? Well, let me tell you, when I go back to Bradford, the city where I was born in Yorkshire, I see in just one tatty billboard, there are others, but on the end of a terraced house, you see this tatty billboard. Traffic that's coming into the city from the east. Can't miss him. You might normally expect a prime spot of advertising real estate like that to carry the image of a recognisable commercial brand, slogan endorsing a certain type of soap or toilet paper or make of car, whatever. But the billboard, it's got none of these things. Instead, its whole length contains a single line of Arabic script from the Quran. No translation, no website address for the curious reader looking to explore further. It is, as Nick Timothy said of those Trafalgar Square prayers, an expression of territoriality. Other people have noticed similar signs in places as far-flung as Leeds and Stoke and sometimes overlooking busy roads, even motorways. You may say, so what? It's a free country. It's advertising space. Bought and paid for. What's your problem? We live in a country where English is our national language, the linguistic glue that holds us together at a time when we need things we can coalesce around more than ever. But here we are now seeing signs, far from being inclusive, which are designed, in my opinion, to make readers feel uncomfortable and unwelcome, strangers in the only country they can call home. I started by saying that this year it will be 25 years, quarter of a century, since 9/11. But 2001 will also be the 25th anniversary of another act of Islamist violence, one frankly now largely overlooked. Not one which captured international headlines for years to follow, even less one which launched a clash of civilizations and brought down regimes. No, this summer it will be a quarter of a century since thousands of Pakistani heritage men took to the streets of my home city of Bradford. You may never have heard of the Bradford riot of July the 7th, 2001, but it warrants the attention of anyone who wants to understand where, if we handle things wrongly, Britain, not just Bradford, Britain could be headed. The violence that day and night saw 300, you heard that right, 300 police officers injured. Previous anniversaries have, frankly, seen the mainstream media present the trouble as a sort of outgassing of pent-up frustration. Not quite justifiable, but comprehensible nonetheless, an explicable reaction to what the impotent political establishment still see, frankly, as the provocations of poverty, racism, marginalisation. In 2021, for instance, on the 20th anniversary of the unrest, The Guardian ran a headline which noted how the 2001 riots boosted the far right. I'm not cherry-picking my stories here. If you do a Google search about the Bradford riot, it's the Guardian headline that pops up first with that predictable take. In my opinion, the riot was, first and foremost, an act of territorial demarcation by young Muslim men, testing the limits of how far the state would go to make its writ run. Guardian, like so many outlets whose journalists have never lived in a city like Bradford, turned the story into one about how the violence had acted as a recruiting sergeant for the far right. You just know that they were going to do that, right? All the while, playing down any idea that white folk could be just as vulnerable to racism, poverty and marginalisation as their brown-skinned neighbours. This kind of asymmetrical coverage is far from new. On the 10th anniversary this time, of the Bradford riot, the BBC went with a headline which said, "Victims of Bradford riot feel no bitterness." That story was based on an interview with two women who were among 23 drinkers inside a Labour club, you heard that right, a Labour club, in the Bradford suburb of Manningham. It was burned to the ground by rioters on July the 7th. The doors to the club were barred, the fire brigade was bricked when their officers arrived to extinguish the fire. Multiple fatalities, frankly, only avoided because people hid in the cellar. I wonder how representative those two women were that the BBC found. The awkward truth is that the majority of white Bradfordians are quite inclined, actually, to remain embittered about their city falling prey to a spasm of racial conflict that was only quelled by the introduction of more than 1,000 riot police officers. Let me try and knit some of this together for you. In 2007, I went back to Bradford. I took a Sky News camera crew with me. I wanted to look at some of the tensions which have, if anything, in my opinion, grown worse as the years have gone by. I took the camera crew. We went to visit the church where I was baptized as a baby. The priest, it turned out, he'd been brought up in Pakistan by missionaries. Presumably that made him a good fit for a suburb where the majority of people were of Kashmiri ancestry. And because he had this background, he spoke pretty good Urdu, rather better, frankly, than many of his parishioners, which meant he could understand some of the racial slurs that were directed at him as he walked his black Labrador around the surrounding streets. But that wasn't really what caught my ear when I met him. What did was the fact that the part of the church was still closed off and under repair. Some local hotheads, according to the priest, tried to set the building on fire. When did that happen? On the night, he said, that the US Air Force began hitting Taliban targets in Afghanistan in 2001.
Good afternoon.
I was just across the border in Pakistan at the time. Didn't you think that was a bit of a coincidence? The night the bombing started against Taliban, or the church we caught fire? Well, the priest preferred not to dwell on it. But are we not entitled to ask, why is it that so many of our fellow British citizens feel such strong ideological kinship with fellow Muslims in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Gaza? What is it that makes them feel such an affinity with their co-religionists thousands of miles away than with their non-Muslim neighbours just around the corner? It is not Islamophobic to ask this question, and don't let the government tell you otherwise. This kind of sectarianism promises to define our politics for years to come. Here's another question raised by my visit to the church where I was baptised. Why, insofar as I've been able to find out, was there no media coverage of the arson attack in 2001? Would an assault on a mosque have gone similarly unreported? Are some crimes weighted more than others? Which is why we end up with a scandal, for instance, like the grooming gangs, willfully ignored by those who should have known better for years. Bradford informs my thinking still. Perhaps because I'm a prisoner of history too. Communities there live parallel lives. They're watchful and wary of one another. Integration, long ago stalled, has gone into reverse. Third and fourth generations of Kashmiri immigrants whose grandparents came to work in the textile mills, the textile industry, they haven't become more British. They've often become more Pakistani, or at least weirdly, actually more Arabic. For years, I thought the city's woes were highly localised, a product of a broken business model, joblessness, despair. Even when, in 1989, Bradford hit the headlines when activists we would later learn to call Islamists burned Salman Rushdie's novel The Satanic Verses in the city centre. The assumption was this: that Bradford was an outlier, an oddity, an economic and sociological curiosity, the sort of city that will one day feature in school lessons as an example of how cities slowly die, like Detroit without the music. But the truth that is dawning on many of us is this: Bradford is not a one-off. Its troubles may be particular, but they're also increasingly nationwide and ubiquitous, from Leicester to Luton, from Birmingham to Batley, from Belfast to Bournemouth, from the south coast to the East End. We face a crisis of cohesion. Is that crisis faithfully reflected via the media back to you? I think not. When I worked for Sky News, I mentioned earlier that I covered that massive flow of migrants from European countries in 2015, reported from Greece, from Serbia, Croatia and Hungary. I was astonished then, still am really, at how many of my journalistic colleagues could only see the influx as an unalloyed, unquestionable good. Where the hell was their scepticism? Even now, when crime or transport congestion or housing shortages or tax rises, you name it, are covered on the BBC, ITV, Sky, there is rarely, if any mention of how all these things have been impacted dramatically by something like an extra, depending how you cut the numbers, 10 million people in 25 years. That is beyond the ability of any country of our size to assimilate. What was it, the recent figures? How could we cope with numbers like that? On current trends, Britain is destined to become a white minority nation by 2063. Now, whatever you think about that, it's a change the likes of which has never happened outside of military conquest and for which democratic assent has neither been sought nor given. The mainstream media simply isn't interested. Too tough a question to even begin to put. But I am. Because growing up in Bradford, I've seen how the promises of multiculturalism have signally failed to deliver. And as I say, increasingly for Bradford, read Britain as a whole. I remain curious and, truth be told, a little bit furious about all of this. I felt sufficiently strongly that the mainstream media didn't get it, that I left a comfortable job with Sky TV back in 2021, even though then as a widower with 6 dependent children, that was a risk. I was on the launch team at GB News, remain hugely proud of what that channel has done to move the Overton window and give hitherto voiceless viewers a voice. A couple of years ago, I tried to head off in a new direction, enrolling at the Royal Agricultural University in Cirencester in Wiltshire, where we live. There are pigs, there are sheep. This week we've been lambing. It's a world I'm utterly enraptured by, and a world very far away from Twitter and trolling, etc., etc. But I've had, maybe you've had too, in recent months, a gnawing feeling that something needs to be done, that certainly I deserted my brothers in arms in the trenches of the culture wars. You remember that quote, "All that's needed for evil to prevail," conservative philosopher Edmund Burke said, "is for good men to do nothing." Well, I've no idea if I'm a good man, but that is for my maker to decide. But it does feel like now is the time to stand up and be counted, because these times, so riddled with cant and peopled by prigs, demand that those of us who have been around the media block tell it the way it really is, rather than what the utopians wish it was. We need commentators with a stake in the future, but with a reverence for our past. My guests will broadly share these views. They will, like me, like you, fear that our national identity is being debased, erased, and effaced. My answer has been to join Outpost, a platform set up by former Royal Marine turned documentarian James Glancy and the brilliant filmmaker come culture warrior Alex Webster. We will, together, wonder out loud how we got here and how we can restore a sense of pride and belonging. At Outpost, our plan is not to trash-talk our opponents, mount ad hominem attacks, or descend into partisan ranting. We aim to offer a thoughtful view of events as they happen, tell new stories, and push the boundaries of this wonderful medium through a brand new slate of podcasts, video essays, and documentaries, and where possible, by playing the ball, not the man. I love my country, and I'm sure all of you watching feel the same about the state of play at the moment. This is my take, but it's yours that matters every bit as much. This is not a one-way conversation. I don't want to talk at you. I want to talk with you. Because Britain, the Britain we knew, is fading from view in thousands of different ways every single day. In isolation, these things don't generate mainstream media coverage, but over time, taken together, they are part of what we all feel in our bones, that Britain is changing for the worse, that Britain is undeveloping. Some people say, stop whinging, it's normal, the world moves on, you're peddling decline porn. We say it's okay to notice, it's okay to be nostalgic for a law-abiding society with high levels of social trust. What are the things which you see, which somehow you're not meant to notice? Changes brought about by immigration or welfare dependency, or a simple hatred of British history. You'll have your own examples, things you've seen, quietly filed away. Share them with us at the Outpost family. See the ways you can talk to us and others at the bottom of the screen.